Imagine being 8 years old, with dreams in your eyes and vulnerability in your heart, but your home is a shelter, and the world feels unstable. This was Relisha Tenau Rudd's life. On March 1, 2014, in Washington, D.C., she vanished. Not on a busy street. Not in a crime-ridden neighborhood, but from a place meant to offer safety, the family homeless shelter. Her disappearance would expose not just the devastating loss of a little black girl, but the cracks in the very systems designed to protect her: child welfare, education, homelessness services. Today, we retell Relisha's story, not as horror, but as truth. Because her name matters. Her story matters. And the failure of systems must be understood.
Welcome to Black HerTruth.
Relisha Tenau Rudd was born on October 29, 2005, in Washington, D.C., a bright little girl who carried a softness in her eyes and a quiet responsibility far beyond her age. By early 2014, she lived with her mother, Shomika Young, her stepfather, Antonio Wheeler, and her younger brothers inside the D.C. General Family Shelter, a massive, aging former hospital that had been converted into a homeless shelter. Families who lived there often described it as unsafe, overcrowded, and chaotic, a place where hundreds of children came and went through dim hallways and shared spaces, all overseen by too few staff and too little structure to truly keep them safe. This was the environment that shaped Relisha's daily life. Inside those walls, friends remembered her as an intelligent, warm-hearted child who loved school, who protected her siblings, and who tried to make the best out of the instability around her. She liked to style her hair, she enjoyed learning, and she carried herself with a gentleness that teachers noticed. But beneath her sweet nature was a vulnerability created by circumstances beyond her control. Life inside the D.C. General Shelter made children like Relisha more susceptible to harm. Reports later described how the facility struggled with supervision, background checks, and staff oversight. Families lived with minimal privacy and constant stress. Her mother, Shomika, was overwhelmed, managing homelessness, caring for several children, and dealing with personal challenges that stretched her ability to maintain consistent routines. Her stepfather worked long periods out of state, leaving an even larger gap in daily support and supervision. These circumstances created openings where outsiders could gain influence over children without immediate suspicion, especially if they seemed helpful, friendly, or resourceful within the shelter. Even as a child, Relisha often acted like a caregiver to her younger brothers. She learned to blend into the background, to adapt, to survive. Teachers later described her as thoughtful and bright, but they also noticed the signs of neglect familiar among children facing homelessness: frequent absences, inconsistent routines, and emotional strain. Yet she was still a little girl who loved hugs, who smiled easily around the people she trusted, and who deserved the safety that society promises every child. In these early chapters of her life, long before the world knew her name, the systems surrounding Relisha were already showing cracks: the overwhelmed shelter, the lack of stability at home, the absence of strong oversight, and the kind of environment where a dangerous adult could slip in unnoticed. It was inside this fragile world that a man named Kahlil Tatum, a janitor with a dark past, would soon become a familiar face to the family, and the last person ever seen with Relisha Rudd. Inside the D.C. General Family Shelter, where hundreds of residents lived in close quarters, staff members often became familiar faces to families simply because they were present in the hallways every day. One of those faces was Kahlil Tatum, a 51-year-old janitor whose job allowed him to move freely throughout the building. To many residents, he appeared helpful, generous, and unusually friendly with children, a behavior that should have raised immediate concern but instead went largely unchecked within the shelter's loose oversight. Tatum had a criminal history, including charges related to firearm offenses and violence, but the shelter's environment lacked the structure and enforcement needed to prevent someone like him from gaining access to vulnerable families. Over time, Tatum developed a relationship with Relisha's mother, Shomika Young, and her step-family. He gave Relisha gifts, toys, a tablet, snacks, and he offered the family things they struggled to provide on their own. In a setting where kindness felt rare, small favors could easily be mistaken for trustworthiness. People in the shelter recalled seeing Tatum around the children frequently, and some described him as someone who's helped out families. But behind his friendliness was a disturbing pattern of boundary breaking. Shelter rules forbade close personal relationships between staff and residents, especially involving children, yet the rule was rarely enforced. Instead, Tatum became viewed almost as a family friend, interacting with Relisha more than any staff member should have been allowed to. As their interactions grew, he began presenting himself in ways that blurred reality. At one point, Tatum reportedly convinced Shomika that he could act as a doctor figure for Relisha, a horrifying manipulation that later became central to her disappearance. He was allowed to take Relisha out of the shelter on multiple occasions, with no formal checkout system to track where a child was going or who was escorting them. These moments, which should have triggered intervention, went unnoticed or unaddressed by shelter administrators. The lack of oversight gave Tatum freedom and access that would prove devastating. Relisha, being only 8 years old, had no way of understanding the danger. She saw someone who offered her care, gifts, and attention, filling emotional and material gaps she did not always receive consistently. To her, he might have simply felt like another adult in her world, someone who made her feel noticed. But the power dynamic was deeply unbalanced, an adult man with a history of violence operating in a space where children had no real protection. The most alarming part of their relationship emerged when Relisha began missing school. Instead of immediate action, a false doctor's note, allegedly attributed to Dr. Tatum, excused her absences for weeks. This should have triggered an urgent investigation, yet the deception went undetected long enough for Tatum to maintain control. Behind the scenes, he was building a facade to hide something far more sinister. By the time authorities discovered that Relisha was not with a doctor, and that no Dr. Tatum existed, the relationship had already crossed every line of safety. The shelter's failures, the school's delayed response, and the trust her family placed in a man they barely knew all collided into a perfect storm of vulnerability. And in the middle of it all was Relisha, a child depending on adults, an adult who manipulated that trust, and a system that failed to intervene before it was too late. Inside the school system, alarm bells should have been ringing far earlier than they did. By mid-March 2014, Relisha had accrued more than 10 unexcused absences at Payne Elementary, triggering school officials to refer her case to DC's Child and Family Services Agency, a referral that came not out of care but out of frustration and concern. Her mother and grandmother repeatedly sent notes excusing her absences, claiming she was ill and under medical care. What the school didn't know, what no one realized until a social worker actually went to the shelter, was that Dr. Tatum didn't exist. The man they believed was her physician was actually Kahlil Tatum, the janitor at the very homeless shelter where she lived. When the social worker visited on March 19, 2014, she confronted him directly. Tatum didn't show up for the meeting, and shelter staff confirmed that there was no doctor residing at the facility, only a janitor by that name. That revelation shattered false assumptions and ignited a full-scale missing person investigation. The social worker reported suspected abuse, and a child abuse hotline was contacted. but the delay in action reflected deeper systemic failure. According to a city report, the school had delayed making a mandatory referral to CFSA even after Relisha reached 10 unexcused absences. They waited to give her mother more time to provide medical documentation. The D.C. Department of Education later recommended changes, better training on truancy law, stricter verification of medical notes, and clarifying when excused absences should trigger further review. City officials later acknowledged that these absences and the phony doctor's note should have raised much more serious concern. D.C.'s Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, Beatriz Otero, called the deception deeply troubling, especially because Tatum's criminal background raised major red flags. Meanwhile, the very systems meant to protect a child had become complicit in her erasure. When a report was finally filed, bureaucratic inertia, poor communication, and a misplaced trust allowed the deception to continue for weeks. Every missed school day was a warning. Every falsified note was another piece of evidence. Yet for too long, no one connected the dots. That negligence, from school authorities, shelter staff, and child welfare systems, formed the crucible in which Relisha's disappearance became not just possible, but tragically inevitable. By the third week of March 2014, the fragile chain of trust and oversight surrounding Relisha Rudd had completely unraveled. On March 1, 2014, she was last seen at the D.C. General Family Shelter, walking alongside Kahlil Tatum, the janitor who had ingratiated himself with her family over weeks of gifts, favors, and attention. To the outside world, he appeared harmless, a man who offered care and support to a child living in difficult circumstances. Inside the shelter, however, the combination of systemic negligence, overworked staff, and insufficient policies had allowed him unfettered access to children. That day, Relisha left the shelter with Tatum under the guise of a routine outing. He claimed to be taking her to a doctor's appointment, continuing the fabricated story that had already convinced her family and school authorities. No formal sign-out procedures existed to track her movements, no staff questioned the outing, and no one at the shelter verified the destination. It was a moment that would later define the tragic case, a window during which a child disappeared without immediate detection. After her departure, Tatum and Relisha were captured in surveillance footage at a nearby hotel in northeast D.C., walking the hallways together. The footage, later released publicly, shows her small frame beside his larger, imposing presence, a stark image that would haunt investigators and the public alike. Tatum had obtained keys to hotel rooms through his employment and personal contacts, using them to facilitate his control over Relisha's movements. Witnesses reported seeing him carrying bags of items for the child, presenting the image of responsible guardianship, but the reality was far darker. The hotel itself, a place frequented by transient populations, lacked the vigilance or reporting mechanisms to alert authorities to the presence of a child in potentially dangerous circumstances. Once Tatum left the hotel vicinity, Relisha vanished from public view entirely. A search was immediately initiated by shelter staff and authorities, but critical hours were lost due to delays in reporting and verification. Her school had not yet connected all the absences to a potential abduction, and the fabricated doctor's notes had prevented timely escalation to law enforcement. The combination of trust in Tatum, systemic oversight failures, and the limited infrastructure for protecting vulnerable children created the perfect storm for his actions. Authorities later confirmed that Tatum's criminal history and prior behavioral red flags should have prompted intervention, yet no single entity acted decisively before the abduction occurred. The public reaction was swift once her disappearance became known. Flyers and alerts were distributed, news coverage amplified the story nationally, and officials described the case as a chilling example of what can happen when vulnerable children are placed in unsafe environments with inadequate supervision. Relisha's family, grief-stricken and desperate for answers, pressed for immediate action while investigators combed through surveillance footage, interviewed shelter staff, and retraced Tatum's movements. Despite these efforts, her whereabouts remained unknown, and Tatum continued to evade direct questioning for days. The abduction was not only a tragedy for the family but also a case study in the failures of systems designed to protect children, a combination of misplaced trust, inadequate procedures, and the manipulation of a predatory adult. Once the news of Relisha Rudd's disappearance reached authorities, the city and federal agencies scrambled to respond, yet the investigation faced immediate hurdles. Shelter staff and school officials had been slow to report her prolonged absences, and the fabricated doctor's notes delayed law enforcement involvement. By the time the Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, officially opened a missing child case, nearly 3 weeks had passed since she was last seen. Investigators quickly identified Kahlil Tatum, the janitor, as the last known adult in her presence. His prior criminal record, including weapons offenses and a history of violence, was immediately flagged, yet he remained unaccounted for in the critical early hours of the search. The case quickly captured national attention. News outlets broadcast her story, emphasizing the disturbing circumstances of a child vanishing from a government-run shelter. Advocates and local leaders expressed outrage over systemic failures, overcrowded shelters, insufficient staff supervision, and inadequate communication between schools, child welfare, and law enforcement. Public pressure intensified when photographs and surveillance footage of Tatum with Relisha were released, showing him escorting her through hotel corridors. The images provoked both shock and horror, underscoring the vulnerability of children in unstable housing and the dangers posed by individuals exploiting gaps in oversight. Community members, volunteers, and advocacy organizations joined the search, distributing flyers and amplifying alerts on social media. #Relisha Rudd and #Missing Child trended as families and concerned citizens demanded swift action and answers. At the same time, law enforcement coordinated with federal agencies, including the FBI, to expand the search radius and trace Tatum's movements. Motel and hotel records were scrutinized, phone and financial records were analyzed, and interviews with shelter residents were conducted to reconstruct Relisha's last known movements. Each lead brought hope and anxiety, as the timeline of her disappearance grew more complex and troubling. In the public discourse, attention also turned to policy reform. Lawmakers, journalists, and child advocacy groups questioned how a child could be removed from a shelter by a staff member without proper verification. Reports criticized the delayed reporting of absences by the school and inadequate safeguards at D.C. General. Calls for systemic change emphasized stricter background checks, formalized sign-out procedures for children, mandatory staff training, and improved coordination between agencies responsible for child welfare. Despite these reforms being discussed, the tragedy of Relisha's disappearance highlighted that promises of reform often follow the most severe failures, rather than preventing them. The search continued intensely for days, weeks, and months, but as leads failed to produce concrete results, frustration mounted. Tatum eventually became the primary suspect, and authorities pursued him across multiple jurisdictions. Weeks after Relisha Rudd's disappearance, the investigation took a dark and shocking turn. On March 30, 2014, Kahlil Tatum was found dead in Anacostia Park, reportedly from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Authorities confirmed his identity, and his death immediately raised questions about the whereabouts of Relisha, who remained missing. With Tatum gone, law enforcement faced a critical challenge. The primary person last seen with Relisha could no longer provide any answers, and the trail of evidence that might have led to her safety had effectively ended. Before his death, Tatum had been living a double life, maintaining a facade of responsibility while exploiting the trust of those around him. Police and federal investigators pieced together that he had taken Relisha to multiple locations within the city, including hotels and vacant apartments, and had manipulated staff and volunteers to avoid scrutiny. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and hotel records confirmed his movements, but crucially, they did not provide any indication of Relisha's location following his disappearance. The news of Tatum's death sparked widespread media coverage and public grief. Many questioned the ability of the city's child welfare and law enforcement systems to protect vulnerable children. Officials acknowledged the systemic failures, the lack of background checks, insufficient supervision at the shelter, delayed school reporting, and gaps in coordination between agencies. Advocates emphasized that while Tatum's death removed the immediate threat, it also meant that answers about Relisha's fate were likely lost forever. The community's search continued, but the passage of time diminished leads. Flyers and public campaigns were updated with age progression images to reflect how Relisha might look now. Social media remained active, with hashtags like #RelishaRudd and #BringRelishaHome keeping attention on the case, and child advocacy organizations pushed for reforms to prevent similar tragedies. Despite these efforts, the case underscored the devastating consequences of compounded negligence, manipulation, and systemic shortcomings. Relisha's disappearance became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities facing children in transitional housing and the importance of rigorous child protection measures. Authorities have never officially located Relisha Rudd, and her case remains open. Each year, advocates and law enforcement continue to issue updates, maintain her missing person profile, and educate the public about warning signs and child safety measures. The investigation into Tatum's activities and associations provided some clarity on his motives and the methods he used to evade suspicion, but the central tragedy, the unknown fate of an 8-year-old child, persists, leaving a lasting mark on the city and those following the case. Years after Relisha Rudd vanished, her disappearance continues to resonate as a tragic reminder of systemic failures and the vulnerabilities faced by children in transitional housing. Despite Kahlil Tatum's death, law enforcement agencies, advocacy groups, and her family have never ceased searching for answers. Her missing person profile remains active with the MPD and NCMEC, and age progression images are regularly updated to aid in identification efforts. The case prompted widespread public discussion on child welfare policies, shelter oversight, and accountability. Reports and investigations highlighted critical lapses, staff inadequacies, delayed reporting of school absences, and insufficient background checks for individuals working with vulnerable children. Community organizations launched campaigns to raise awareness about child safety, and many parents, social workers, and volunteers now use Relisha's story as a cautionary tale to educate about warning signs of exploitation and the importance of vigilance in protecting children. Media outlets continue to cover the story periodically, ensuring that the public does not forget her case. National campaigns using hashtags such as #RelishaRudd, #MissingChild, and #BlackGirlsMatter have maintained visibility, reminding the community and authorities alike that unresolved cases of missing children demand attention. Her family continues to appeal for information, and federal and local law enforcement encourage anyone with knowledge of her whereabouts to come forward. The tragedy of Relisha's disappearance underscores the importance of early intervention, proper communication between agencies, and protective measures in shelters. Her story has inspired reforms in how children in shelters are supervised, including stricter background checks for staff, formalized sign-out procedures, and mandatory reporting protocols for absences or suspicious activity. Advocates argue that these systemic improvements, though implemented too late for Relisha, may prevent future tragedies and save lives. Even without closure, Relisha's legacy endures. She symbolizes both the innocence of childhood lost to exploitation and the societal responsibility to protect our most vulnerable. Her story serves as a stark lesson that trust in adults must be balanced with oversight, that systems must be accountable, and that communities must remain vigilant to safeguard children. Through public awareness campaigns, education, and ongoing advocacy, the hope remains that one day she may be found, or at the very least, her case will continue to prevent similar tragedies. Thank you for watching. If you found this story impactful and want to help keep these kinds of stories from being forgotten, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, stay with us.